We're going to be jumping around Luke 11 a lot and kind of Luke 6 through 11 a little bit, just the overall impact of this whole series so far. So Luke 11 basically starts off with stuff about prayer. Jesus talks about the Lord's Prayer and then a couple parables that encourage us to bring our requests to God. And then he casts out a demon, and then people are challenging his authority and how he did that and kind of trying to squirm out of what's clearly happening and what it means for their lives. And then the third part of it is kind of these woes, these like warnings and rebukes that he gives to the Pharisees and the scribes. And so we're going to kind of tie all of that together, and I'm assuming that you either have read this recently or will read it shortly. So we're not going to read large sections of it, but we will read little bits and pieces. So I wanted to start by talking about Jesus' authority and power. And this is kind of coming from the weird parts where he's casting out the demon and then they're debating about it. And that's in Luke 11, verses 20 to 23. And in the middle of that dialogue, Jesus says, "When a strong man, fully armed, guards his house, his possessions are safe. But when someone stronger attacks and overpowers him, he takes away the armor in which the man trusted and divides up his plunder." That's kind of a little analogy Jesus threw in to kind of explain what was going on. And I had to read a commentary to realize something very obvious, which is that in this parable, Jesus is this strong man that's overpowering the less strong man, and taking away the armor in which he trusted and dividing up his plunder. So it's a very surprising thing that he says. I also think it's worth pointing out that this exorcism that he does is far from an isolated incident. When you read the Gospels, there's a few examples of exorcisms that they zoom in on and tell the story a little bit, but there's also these summary statements, like in Luke 6:18. It just says, "Those troubled by impure spirits were cured, and the people tried to touch him because power was coming from him and healing them all." And a few weeks ago we talked about in 9 verse 1, it says that Jesus gave the 12 power and authority to drive out all demons, among other things. So don't think there's just a couple of these that happen. We're probably looking at hundreds or thousands of these. And so it's not just like a little skirmish on the side. It really is Jesus and his disciples were bringing a wrecking ball to the kingdom of darkness. And I just wanted to briefly address, I think we get paralyzed by how weird and confusing this is because we don't tend to think in terms of spiritual oppression a whole lot. So we would think more in terms of psychology or medicine. And so what is this? How is it different? And Ian Proven, who came down recently, he said something helpful when he was asked about this. He just said, it's very, very difficult to discern the difference between mental health issues and spiritual issues. And he thinks a lot of Christians really fail to appreciate how difficult that is to discern and how much time it takes, and it has to be on a case-by-case basis and stuff like that. So when he said that, it kind of gave me permission to not feel like I have to have one dumb, simplistic answer to every case. And there's also just the limitations of I haven't lived in different parts of the world where there's a lot more kind of old school paganism and how that might affect these things. There's just a lot of mystery and a lot of discernment that's needed. So we don't have to just feel embarrassed about it or try to avoid it. And if we could put up the first slide, as we're going to be celebrating Good Friday and Easter this week very soon, and the stuff Jesus says about overpowering the devil, there's this image. It's a icon image that's been around in the church for a long time. I think it goes back at least to the 9th century. And I'm going to get a little out of my depth here, so Landon, if I say anything wrong, I'm kind of in your territory, just mute me, and then I'll know to just move on. Landon, I'm just pretending to know about church history and stuff. He actually knows. But this is a really cool image that is very much along the themes of Jesus' authority and power. And it's cool because we get to see Jesus looking like a superhero. He's diving down to the lowest place and rescuing humanity. And so I'll just point out a little bit of this. His robe is always flaring up in the back to symbolize how radical his descent is. Like he's diving down and it's coming up behind him. Maybe it's a parachute when you're going down to Hades. So kind of the Philippians too. He lowered himself all the way down to be a human and to be a servant and to die and to go down into Hades or hell and be resurrected and then receive power. And then there's verses like Hebrews 2:14 that say, by his death he destroyed him who holds the power of death, that is, the devil. And the way that that's been said a lot in liturgies is trampling death by death, which is just a very profound idea. Can we go to the next one? Is it going to be slow, or is it? That'll work. So yes, he's holding a giant cross in this one that goes all the way down and is stabbing a dude who represents death and the devil, which is amazing. And he's always holding Adam. So the people that he's pulling up out of the tombs represent Adam. They're Adam and Eve. So humanity is being pulled out from death. And he's holding their wrists. He's not, like locking hands with them. He's just pulling them out because it's kind of symbolizing the theological teaching that it's by his power and grace that this is being done, not our own striving. And there's always those little rectangles right under him. Those represent the gates of Hades, because like when Peter made his confession of Jesus, he said, the gates of hell will not prevail against this confession or his church. Right. And so the people on the left are usually like some of the prophets from the Old Testament, and the people on the right are some of the disciples. So let's go to the next one. Yeah, this one really accentuates the like his robe being pulled up by the draft from him coming down so radically. Another one. Oh, I'm sorry. That's a mistake. Sorry, I was confused. That's a different story where someone humbles himself all the way down to the point of death and lays down his life to save his friends and the dead. So let's go to the next one. Yeah, and so this is like a more kind of modern sort of remixed version of it from an artist. I shared this with Erin because I was like, isn't this so cool? But she's kind of taking these traditional church icon kind of themes or ways of presenting people and remixing them a little bit to be a little more modern. All this to say, like, Jesus wins. And that's good news. And he's the one we have to deal with. If you want in on his victory in life and salvation, you need to listen to him. And in this passage, people are trying to explain away his authority or change the subject, but he's insisting, the kingdom of God has come upon you. Don't try to deny or ignore it. Rather, hear the word of God and obey it. And so that's what we're going to turn our attention to for the rest of this sermon. And probably the main theme is when he's, giving these rebukes to the Pharisees and the scribes, he talks about, you're concerned about the outward appearances, not the inside of the cup. And that's what I felt most burdened to talk about today. So in this and the last several chapters, when we were discussing this in small group, I was like, man, it's hard to, like, my mental image of Jesus is having to get updated because I tend to think of him being very, like, kind and sweet. And if someone comes to him with a question, I picture him as saying, like, I just so want to honor, like, the heart behind that and the journey behind this question, and like be like the kind of teachers we like these days. But instead, almost everyone gets like a firm redirection or correction or even like a warning or a rebuke. I mean, it's probably 80-90%. It's not everyone, but I was like, man, it's just like he's acting like Brad. Like everyone is somehow wrong or not good enough or whatever, or like somehow needs to be corrected. And so we need to make sure Brad doesn't ever read this chapter, because if he finds out about it, he's going to feel even more justified to act that way. We need him to be nicer. I'm just kidding. And that really made me think, why is he acting this way toward people? And I think it's because they needed correction more than affirmation. And are we so different? Are we too quick to assume, like, well, if I was there, it would be a whole lot of sweet affirmation and you're doing so great, and I wouldn't need correction or to humble myself and listen. So I think he was acting this way toward people because what they truly needed was correction more than affirmation. And there's just kind of like a teachable moment here. Do you ever wonder, like, why is God in the Old Testament so scary and judgmental, and Jesus in the New Testament is so, like, merciful and loving? Do you ever feel like there's a disconnect there? Or is it just me? Appreciate that. So I've definitely struggled with this, but the more time passes and the more time that I've spent in the Old and New Testament, the less I see the difference. And I want to just propose 3 reasons why we might think there's more of a difference than there is. The first one is that we miss God's love, patience, grace, and forgiveness in the Old Testament. There's just so many, if you read like the Psalms and stuff, they see him that way. And so if we're looking at the events that take place and wondering how to interpret them, we look at it from our vantage point and say like, wow, God seems pretty scary and harsh and doesn't seem like he has great character or whatever. But the people who were actually there saw it completely differently. So we might want to think about like, well, maybe if this was actually their culture and their history and their events, maybe they know how to look at it a little better than us. Thousands of years later on the other side of the world, we might want to wrestle with that. And the more I've wrestled with it, I'm like, yeah, there's a lot of really profound expressions and actions of grace and patience and mercy and forgiveness in the Old Testament. And I think that can be a little bit lost on us. The second thing is we don't understand sometimes the seriousness of the evil that God was responding to in the Old Testament. It'll just say like, and they had the Asherah poles and worshiped Baal or something. We don't really know what that means, but that stuff was really dark. Like child sacrifice on a fire, and he's constantly railing against them for oppressing the poor and oppressing foreigners and things like that, and things that are very serious. So those are two on the Old Testament side that kind of pull our view of God in the Old Testament closer to how we want to see God in the New Testament. And this is the opposite. So the third one, which is much more tied into the sermon, is we minimize and forget about Jesus' harshness and his judgment. And so in this chapter and the previous chapter, Jesus speaks of judgment and woes, and he even compares his generation to some of the scariest moments in the Old Testament where God is at his most like scary and harsh. And he's saying the stakes now are even higher and the judgment he's pronouncing is even greater. And so, yeah, we kind of we make like a nice version of Jesus in our minds sometimes, accidentally, and that causes the distance between how we see God in the Old Testament and the New Testament to be even greater. But I think those are all more, the more time goes on, the less I see a big difference. And so kind of getting into the latter part of this chapter, Jesus, he pronounces these woes toward the Pharisees and the scribes. And again, kind of leaning on the fact that we've all been reading this, hopefully, I'll just list them out. He calls them out on greed, wickedness, false outward appearances, a lack of generosity to the poor, a neglect of justice, a neglect of love of God, making it harder than it needs to be for people to approach God, offering no help in people approaching God, and obscuring knowledge of God. And there's stuff about killing prophets and building their tombs that I didn't go down that rabbit hole. So there's a lot that could be said about that, but there's a lot there. And when you picture this scene where he's reclining at the Pharisees' table and he doesn't wash his hands, and then it starts this whole thing, if you were going to picture yourself in that scene, where do you see yourself in it when he's doling out these rebukes? Do you see yourself at his side saying, yeah, you tell him? Do you wonder if you might be on the receiving end of some of those rebukes? And when he's getting into this stuff, he couldn't say anything more dire and alarming. There's not any stronger language he could reach for. And so he's falling all over himself, doing everything he can to shake people awake. And yet it's all too easy to miss it, either by assuming that he's talking to someone else and being like, yeah, I hate when people are like that, and not even questioning whether it's in you. Or just kind of forgetting about it and just thinking about the really kind of nicer things that he says instead. In our small group, as we were talking about this stuff, Matthew Garris, who I thought I saw over there he is, just bringing you up. He made, if you know Matthew, you know that he just kind of wears his heart on his sleeve and is just very earnest. And so we were reading something, it was actually Luke 12, which gets even more intense than 11 somehow. And he was like, yeah, this stuff about, this is kind of crazy. I'm like, well, that's definitely Jesus, because I just read it. But that's not the Jesus I have in my mind, and I need to fix that. And we all were like, yeah, like that's how we feel. And so that's one of the things that's been really good about this series, going through Luke, is like we're just kind of seeing the whole picture of how he's presented. And so I wanted to say a little bit about the Pharisees' neglect of justice, because that's a loaded word that has a lot of competing definitions floating around in our culture. And so I just wanted to very briefly give you a quote to consider. It's from a guy named Miroslav Volf, which is kind of a crazy name to me. So he's Croatian. It was Yugoslavia when he was born. And he says something challenging, but it's not like he hasn't thought about it much. Like me saying it with my relatively easy life doesn't mean a whole lot, but him saying it, his country was torn apart by civil wars that were marked by ethnic cleansing and all kinds of other war crimes, and he's written books on how to try to reconcile that stuff from a Christian perspective. And this is what he has to say. He says, "Forgiveness flounders because I exclude the enemy from the community of humans, and I exclude myself from the community of sinners. Forgiveness flounders because I exclude the enemy from the community of humans, even as I exclude myself from the community of sinners." And so be on guard that whatever your vision of justice is, that it doesn't do either of those things, that it doesn't dehumanize your enemies, and that you don't lose touch with your own sinfulness. Right. Because forgiveness and reconciliation are difficult, if not impossible, if you do those things. And so, with so much emphasis on the inside of the cup, like in verse 39, the plank in your own eye, going back to chapter 6, seeking forgiveness and avoiding temptation from the Lord's Prayer at the beginning of this chapter, with all of that, we can't risk assuming that he's talking to someone else. Right. And so that whole section was called, "If You're Not Concerned, You're Not Listening." And then this next little section, I'm calling it, if you're not concerned, you're not listening, and that concern should lead to humble self-examination. Jumping ahead in Luke 18, he has the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector who are both doing their prayers in the temple. And he starts that by saying, to some who were confident of their own righteousness, he said, blah, blah, blah. And the moral of the story is the guy who won't even lift his face to heaven but beats his breast and says, "Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner," is the one that went home justified. And he told that to people who are confident of their own righteousness. So are you confident of your own righteousness? In verse 35, he says, of chapter 11, he says, "See to it that the light within you is not darkness." And in 11, when he's talking about the inside of the cup stuff and all the woes, he says something like pay alms to the inside of the cup. I read the NIV application commentary, and then the guy that wrote it said, "I disagree with the NIV translation because it doesn't make any sense in this context, but I think he's saying like pay alms to the inside of the cup." But the other translations say it much more straightforward, or the other gospels say it much more straightforwardly and just say clean the inside of the cup, not just the outside. And some of us I've been here a lot, and a fair few of us are here now, but we're very concerned about justifying God's ways to humans. And perhaps we should sprinkle in some more concern about whether we can justify our ways to God. Can we put up that question slide? Okay, cool. Yeah, so this is something that Devin found recently and shared with me and another friend. And so John Wesley was kind of a reformer who brought this great revival of the church. And he and some of his friends, they called themselves the Holy Club, which sounds kind of weird. I think they were maybe less allergic to seeming that way. I don't know. But I don't really want to read all of these, but I do want to read some of them. And what I want you to notice is just the heart posture. So he and his friends, they would ask themselves these 22 questions every single day. And I can't imagine what it would do to a person to actually do that. What would happen to your life? The first couple are, I know this is too small to read, but that's not really the point. I'll read some of them for you. The first one is, am I consciously or unconsciously creating the impression that I am better than I really am? In other words, am I a hypocrite? Oh, thank you. Am I honest in all my acts and words, or do I exaggerate? Do I confidentially pass on to another what was told to me in confidence? Can I be trusted? Am I a slave to dress, friends, work, or habits? Am I self-conscious, self-pitying, or self-justifying? When did I last speak to someone else about my faith? This is the last one on the slide. Do I insist upon doing anything about which my conscience is uneasy? Jumping down to 16. Am I jealous, impure, critical, irritable, touchy, or distrustful? How do I spend my spare time? Is there anyone whom I fear, dislike, disown, criticize, hold a resentment toward, or disregard? If so, what am I doing about it? Do I thank God that I am not like other people, especially not like the Pharisee who despised the publican? And so that's just like a sampling of them. But gosh, can you imagine facing those truths every day? But it also seems very freeing, because it's like we spend so much time just trying to justify our actions to ourselves or to God or something, and ruminating on how other people fall short. But just saying, like, I don't need to hold on to any of that. Like, I'm an open book, God. Please just tell me what I need to know and help me. I just love the heart posture of this. It's very humble. It's humble, take no prisoners, open-handed self-examination. And with this inside of the cup stuff, I think that's what Jesus is inviting us into. And I just thought that was such a striking example. And if you give much time and thought to those kinds of questions, at some point you realize, if I'm going to try to justify my ways to God, that's going to be, I've got like a giant mountain of problems on the inside of the cup, and I don't know what I'm going to do. So justifying my ways to God is going to be very uphill, and it's hard to see how this is going to work out, and that's just the part that I can see right now. How much is in my blind spots? And so that should lead us to this realization, like, if God is not merciful, I'm in a lot of trouble. I need him to be merciful with me. And so the fourth point is that humility should make you merciful. So it's almost like there's just this cheat code laying on the ground. If you start to really do enough introspection to realize how many problems are on the inside of your cup, and you're like, man, I really have a problem here if I'm going to try to justify all this to God. Going back to chapter 6 again, he says, do not judge and you will not be judged. Do not condemn and you will not be condemned. Forgive and you will be forgiven. Give and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, will be poured into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. And even in chapter 11, in the Lord's Prayer, he says, forgive us our sins, because we also forgive everyone who sins against us. And so it's like, man, I need God to be merciful to me, and so I need to figure out how to become a merciful person. And so, all the way back in chapter 6, and as we've been reading through, I've been very, kind of disturbed and unsettled by Jesus in a way that has been pretty uncomfortable. He says so many of these harsh things, or just alarming, or encouraging some serious introspection. And so I wrote down this prayer. It's kind of vulnerable to share, but I felt like I should a few weeks ago. And I'm still kind of in this question. I haven't resolved this yet. Jesus, I'm concerned because I can't tell whether I've been deceived. Have I tamed, declawed, or domesticated your message? Have I psychologized it beyond recognition? Have I made it about my own inner peace to the neglect of outer peace? Do I only love those who love me back? Have I failed to give you food, drink, shelter, clothes, and company? Do I distance myself physically and emotionally from what I should be mourning? Am I too quick to spend money and energy on my stability and comfort of my own life, while I'm too hesitant to spend money and energy on others? Have I skipped over your warnings? Am I living for this age? Am I doing what you require? How can one so wealthy, well-fed, well-pleased, and well-liked inherit the kingdom? I'm not at all sure right now. Don't confuse me with riddles and condemn me for not comprehending. Be good to me by being clear enough to me. Help me to trust in your goodness. Teach me to forgive freely and measure generously with others, so that you will forgive freely and measure generously with me. Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. And so I've shared this with some trusted friends and mentors, and, I could answer this question myself and just say, I could quote some Bible verses to myself and be like, oh, but yeah, God's grace, and whatever. But I don't want to shut it down prematurely. And so I've, sought advice about it, and what I've heard from people pretty consistently is that I'm probably supposed to be wrestling with these questions, and that I'm probably being called to a new kind of maturity and sacrifice, and I need to let God show me what that's going to look like. And so what is that prayer for you? What is Jesus making you question about your ways? In my notes it says maybe include some possible suggestions, but I didn't write that down. So you'll have to figure it out yourself. So in conclusion, I just wanted to talk also about his approachability. I can't do a sermon without quoting C.S. Lewis. And he said, the New Testament is where I have found terror and comfort most intertwined. The New Testament is where I have found terror and comfort most intertwined. In chapter 12, which we're going to get to next week, there's a part where Jesus says, don't fear those who can destroy the body, but fear him who can throw the body and the soul into hell. And then immediately after that, he says, don't fear because you are worth more than many sparrows. So I'm like, whoa! This is emotionally nuanced. But yeah, the New Testament was where I found terror and comfort most intertwined. And so, if anything, I've been heavy on the terror side, but there's also some very beautiful, amazing, comforting things at the beginning of this about prayer. In verses 11 through 13, Jesus says, which of you fathers, if your son asks for a fish, will give him a snake instead? Or if he asks for an egg, will give him a scorpion? If you have such noble instincts, then you can approach God on the basis of your goodness, and he will reward you with whatever you ask. Wait, no, that's not right. That wasn't what it says. That was a trick. What he actually says, if you then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give the Holy Spirit to those who ask him? So even while Jesus is trying to persuade us to bring our requests to God and approach him, he's also just bluntly acknowledging our evil. And people who recognize their own evil can appreciate that and not be scared off by it and not have this feeling that we need to clean ourselves up before we bring our questions to God and ask him for his help and the Holy Spirit in addressing those things. So don't try to clean yourself up first. Ask him what you need to hear about the inside of the cup and ask for his help in setting it right. We're going to sing a song. I probably should have had Al come up sooner because now there's going to be an awkward gap. But that's all I have. Thank you.